Hi, so I'm here to make another astrology video. This time, the moon is in Gemini right now, and we're leading up to a full moon in Leo. But right now, the moon is in Gemini, just about to go into Cancer. And in Gemini, Mars is in a trine to the sun. That's pretty close. And Saturn is there with the sun in Aquarius. And they're in the midst of Saturn, or we're in the midst of Aquarius season. It's snowy out where I live. There's a polar vortex. Apparently it's a lot colder in other places than where I live. And I had an idea for what to do for this, for something more to do with Saturn and Aquarius, and also Mars in Gemini. And because they are both in air signs, and we're having this trine today, that's pretty close with the Sun and Mars. There's the idea that I'm thinking about has to do with the Orthodoxy, basically. And by the Orthodoxy, I mean, Saturn is typically associated with things that are maybe more conservative, maybe authoritarian, more restrictive, maybe the rigidity of dogma that people tend not to like very much, right? But when it comes to like Gemini, right, I was talking about the idea of a dialectic, or that Gemini often stands for something multiple. Like you have the twins is the symbol for Gemini, but it could also be, a group, or like a arcade or something like this, like a kid in a candy store with all the different options, the mutable, multiple things going on, right? And and there's something about the world that we live in, our secular society and its multiculturalism and it's all those different influences and stuff like that, sort of is kind of like Gemini-like, right? And in the exchange, Mercury, being a kind of a merchant, a trader, a communicator, to go and make deals and change and communicate between different parties, between different cultures. It's all very Gemini-like, right? Whereas Saturn is more of like the restrictive. Saturn eats its children, right? Saturn's the more to say no to things and to reject things, or to be also the conservative. We want to just conserve our old traditional values and all this kind of stuff. And the thing is that like I said, I tend to be more of a left-wing guy, but obviously there's a trend recently towards the whole, what they call the trad cath stuff or whatever, or there's the young people being interested in more conservative religion stuff like that. And in some way, I suppose that I maybe am fitting to this trend, or at least I am listening to guys from weird studies a lot. I have my own interest in spirituality and religion and stuff like that, but I'm listening to people that are whatever. Like the stuff I'm exposed to is talking more favorably in terms of whatever traditional Christianity, or trying to reconcile some of the differences between maybe the progressive left and conservative traditionalism and stuff like this. And I kind of think it's already sort of implicit in a way, because there's this whole thing about like the cultural appropriation stuff, right? That in some way, like, don't get me wrong, I'm into meditation and all that, but I also like Japanese culture to some extent, like watching like Kurosawa movies or anime or something like that. But there's something about that, if I'm going to meditation, that there's a need for it not to be about trying to run off into some Orientalist, the American having the fantasy of some exotic thing that they're escaping their life to some, but like that's not what it's supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be about escaping your own situation of your identity and who you are, or using the thing of like, becoming nobody to avoid the reality of me as a white guy, or well, that comes with that, or whatever, the identity politics. But the thing it's unfortunately I had some resistance and hesitancy to making this video because what I wanted to talk about was this documentary called Unorthodox that I watched for the first time recently, which is all about Israel, basically. And I was think that the point that I wanted to make about this, I thought was interesting because it's like to use it as an example of how the apparent dichotomy between progressive liberal minded kind of stuff and conservative stuff is maybe not such a dichotomy after all. However, like, even approaching this subject, I feel like there's all this problematic stuff because obviously, okay, one thing, the war in Palestine, for one thing, with Palestine, and also for another thing, all the anti-Semitism that goes on, and that, like, you don't want to, first of all, just saying that I don't really want to get into any of that stuff. But I don't also want to just treat it as being totally neutral, as if those things aren't important issues worth considering, and that, but I don't want to be, sway too much in one direction about what my feelings are about Israel. But I mean, I think in general, I often take this position that, you can respect a culture, you can respect a tradition, you can respect a people, but you can still say, so there are certain nation states that do terrible things in terms of violence and aggression and war and all this kind of stuff, right? And I don't, it's a complicated issue that you don't expect me to solve in one astrology video, right? But the point, though, anyway, with that aside, this thing about Orthodox Jews in America and the culture of going to Israel, and I have to admit that when I was a young man, I spent a couple of years going around and partying, and one of the, it was when, EDM or whatever, dubstep and that kind of stuff started getting popular, whatever, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, that kind of thing, and eventually I ended up leaving my side of my neck of the woods here and going international and traveling around a bit and winding up at Psytrance parties. And because basically in Canada, there's like a bit of Psytrance parties, but they're not very good. I'm just going to say it. I'm going to apologize to all the Canadian Psytrance DJs out there, but your parties aren't as good as the ones in other countries. I mean this like respectfully, but it's just not the same. It's like the, to put a philosophical spin on it, if there's some kind of like emanationist model where there's like the perfect form of what the perfect Psytrance party is, and that like it attempts to throw a party or to get closer to this like fantasy ideal of what the ultimate Psytrance rave would be like, that I would say that the Vancouver Psytrance Scene is fallen far from the ideal. It's not very good. I'm sorry, as a Canadian guy who's been traveling, I have to say, like, that the only value in the Canadian Psytrance scene to me is to blow a little bit of air onto the last dying embers of my nostalgia for Psytrance from going to real Psytrance parties. But then, I don't know, I shouldn't. It also has to do with my own personal relation to the scene in Canada versus in whatever, just having fun being international, right? But the problem about this whole thing, about being some random international Psytrance kind of stuff is, like, what am I trying to say? If I was going to be a Psytrance DJ, right? If that was an option on the table, that I'm just gonna like, I'll just give in. I'll just start DJing Psytrance music and embrace my love for Psytrance. At some point in time, I would probably end up playing a bunch of Israeli Psytrance producers, right? Which kind of leads me into this issue of that there's some inevitable thing that I think that happens with maybe the rave scene or that party culture, in that you realize the fundamental, what the Buddhists call dukkha, right? The suffering or the unsatisfactoriness of it. That even if it's something that you do there's some way that you can never quite get there, right? Whether that's trying to make the perfect track, whether that's trying to throw the perfect party, whether that's trying to not either to just have all the obstacles or issues that are plaguing, it could just be like, it could seem like that to do what the ideal thing is not that hard, except for all these pain in the ass problems that life creates as obstacles, as in, viruses and COVID and all this kind of stuff. He just kind of goes with the Gnostic, fallenness of the situation, perhaps. But what am I trying to get at here? Psytrance, Israel. There's a big Psytrance scene in Israel, but in that movie Unorthodox, there's something where like the kids will go to Israel and they will be there's this kind of understanding that the kids are in their early 20s and that they want to have fun and they want to have party, and then that's kind of a normal thing to do. And there's this kind of stereotype though that like strict religious stuff prohibits that, and that it's a complete going against this, the values. But what tends to happen more often than not is that the kids party for a while, become disillusioned with how empty it is, and then just end up being more into the religious stuff, so that it actually, it's like in some way there's almost like a conspiracy that like the Israeli Psytrance scene is there to support the religion of Judaism in Israel. They're completely complicit with each other, and they're feeding kids back into the religion, right? Especially because it's psychedelic, right? Because kids are probably taking all these drugs, and I'm like, oh my god, God and life is beautiful, and this music kind of sucks, but I'll just be religious, it'll be good, It's like, it seems like there's a big funneling thing from the Psytrance, or whatever, like psychedelic culture too, just in general, in that, well, you can see it with Ram Dass, that like, eventually you just stop taking acid, and you go to India, and you meditate, and it's a different, you don't have to be so hung up on the hedonistic thrill, because it's a short-lived thing that just kind of burns out, right? That it's just right? But it kind of conveniently leads into the stuff about Byung and the Burnout Society, and the thing I was trying to talk about in my video about Byung, about the scent of time, about how astrology has to do with constellations, which are patterns, which are groups of different lights, rather than Byung-Chul talking about an information society where each thing, like, let's talk about, I'm making a video, right? I'm making a video and I'm putting it on YouTube, and okay, it does exist within like, each of my videos can be seen as a star, right? That is like dotting out a constellation, right? But in that paradigm, it's sort of like, unless I produce content, unless I do this thing where I'm producing a video and putting that out, and there's this big gap, then there's nothing there. Like, the only thing that's there is just me creating stuff, and there's pressure to just create stuff all the time to fill the gap with content, right? And one of those, that's kind of my issue with why I was trying to read Byung-Chul and get over this, to be like, what am I doing? Do I really want to get, is it right to make this like a practice where I'm going to put myself on the hook to just churn out content day after day after day, and as a kind of religious thing almost, right? Like, I'm devoted to just making content for my little smartphone device, right? That is almost like the Apple logo. It's a kind of, and Byung-Chul talks about smartphones are almost like rosary beads, right? Like, you're saying praying with the rosary on your phone, devoting some, it's kind of bizarre, but that weird culty Steve Jobs stuff is all baked in there, right? Kind of rambling maybe. Hold on. I got my point though. It's only, we're not even 15 minutes in. My main point was this whole thing though about how what I'm kind of approaching in some of my videos, especially with Mars and Gemini, is the two-sidedness, the two-facedness, the kind of being able to be like the zebra who has black and white at the same time. And that when it comes to this problem about religion and spirituality and stuff, is that there's also this great movie, what's it called? Heart Huckabees, where there's this existential detective agency. It's kind of like awkward to try to explain the concept of the movie if you haven't seen it, because it's sort of conceptual. But there's this whole thing where there's like there's the person who's working for the nihilists, or the other side, the not so positive side, right? And it's all meaningless. Just give in, do what you want or whatever, right? And then, but it turns out they're actually working for the same team, right? That they're like the decadents, right? The decadent poets who or whatever, right? And also Chogyam Trungpa had this thing that was like, if you had a problem with sin and vice, like you wanted to go and like drink and smoke and party and whatever, that he would be like, well, if you're hung up on that, the first thing to do is we're going to devote some time to just doing that for a while. And by the time you're like hung over and, depressed and you're completely burnt out with that lifestyle, then we can do some spiritual stuff and you'll appreciate it. So like and we will like Giant, but he had a bad reputation as being whatever, he being drunk all the time. But I mean, the whole thing about Chogyam Trungpa too is the guy was born into being a Tibetan lineage holder. You don't have a choice about being a Tibetan lineage. You just get born, you get selected, you're reincarnated. If you want to go and party and like screw girls and not be a Buddhist master, tough luck. You don't have a choice. You just have to make that work if you want to, right? You have to like, and I don't like look at like can you I don't know. I see him as more of like that pressure to be. The pressure to be expected to be somebody, and who are you really? Are you really? Is Chogyam like the whole thing about this reincarnated masters and bodhisattvas and stuff like that? Is it literally real, or is it like a convention that you have to adhere to, and you have to pretend to be a guru even though that's not who you? Is that what Trine, or was it legit? And the all the vices were just part of or what? It's kind of maybe you have to kind of pick it apart, but it's. The whole thing is that kind of mess of it's very Mars and Gemini, and the Marsy the whatever. I don't have to go, but I'm saying there's something about the Mars, the malefic, the Gemini part, and then the Saturn, which is more restrictive, and then in the trine though that we have right now between Gemini and Aquarius, it's more harmonious, and we have this opportunity to be like, wait a minute, what's the problem here? Where's the dichotomy? Like why? What's the problem? Why can't you just do it? So and which is essentially trying to create the synthesis of the opposites, or trying to reconcile the differences, and to not be in such a polarized kind of situation about. And whatever they call in the Buddhist, the Bodhis, the middle way, right? Of not falling into extremes. Well, whatever. I think I've expressed my idea for this video. Okay, there we go. You can like and subscribe and whatever, I don't have any classes. I'm not going to teach you anything. And, if you want to know about whatever zodiacal releasing, I don't know what to say right now. Sorry.